Will an all-new global reserve currency overthrow the mighty dollar? A well-respected media outlet just said the US is doing its best, or worst, to debase and dethrone the almighty dollar. Is the US really inflicting damage on its own currency? Hold on to your hats, but possibly not your dollars, as we explain everything in this video today. If you believe the doomsday preachers, there's a possibility that something might happen in the near future that will make the 2008 economic crash look like a walk in the park. But before we get to that, we might ask why currencies can tank. We'll start with a really extreme example of Germany, but it serves as an interesting story of how things can go very wrong very quickly. Great economies and their currencies have tanked before, as happened to Germany in the 1920s, and it all happened because of inflation or hyperinflation. Generally, normal inflation is about 2% yearly. When it becomes hyperinflation, it could be 50% a month or as much as 14,000% per year. The Investopedia website just asked if the US is headed toward hyperinflation. The article cited an economic analyst who said hyperinflation will eventually hit the US when the American people decide they would rather live their lives as free rather than as slaves to an unpayable national debt, whose interest will eventually consume more of the federal budget than the military expenditures. Let that sink in. But for now, let's not just laugh off the possibility of hyperinflation in the US of A. Let's now look at the extreme example of Germany in detail. There's a story that a man went to a baker with a wheelbarrow full of cash. He was using it to buy a loaf of bread. But while he was talking to the baker, someone stole his parked wheelbarrow and left all the money behind. That's hyperinflation, the extreme version. At the time, the newspaper correspondent for The Guardian said she had to go to a tailor to make some small alterations to her clothes. She was charged 24 billion marks. This was in a country that had been one of the strongest economies in the world less than a decade earlier, when $1 was worth around 4 to 5 marks. The inflation started during World War I, when Germany was printing money and borrowing money to pay for its costly military expenditures. The plan was to win the war and demand reparations from the vanquished countries, but as you know, it's not how things worked out. Note, sometimes things can go very wrong very quickly. Under the Treaty of Versailles, after Germany had lost the war, it was hit with overly severe reparations that some people said would create so much hardship that Germany would one day fight back. Lo and behold, it happened when Adolf Hitler came on the scene and told everyone that he would make things right again. In the early 1920s, the marks per dollar rose to 2,000 marks, and then to 20,000, to a million, and up and up. It increased so fast that the waiters at restaurants had to stand up and shout to all the customers about the new prices on the menu. Kids started playing with money like it was nothing, making kites out of bills. The German government told printing companies to make more printing machines and print more and more money. It became worthless. The public started bartering for goods with anything but money, cigarettes, or anything they owned. The cheapest wallpaper was made out of money. Housewives used bills to light their stoves. If you print a lot of money, you might have a temporary positive effect, but the prices of goods and services will soon increase. Money becomes less valuable, and people try to offload it. Chaos ensues. The banks might have to print larger denominations. When hyperinflation began in Zimbabwe in 2007, they printed the largest denomination bill in history, a crisp $100 trillion bill. More recently in Venezuela, they had removed 6 zeros from the currency so the average purchase wouldn't involve hundreds of trillions of Venezuelan bolivars. Many countries had a dark era in their history when they experienced hyperinflation, including China, France, Vietnam, Argentina, Poland, the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Greece. Notably, the USA is not on that list, and most people don't expect it to be anytime soon, but some do. How extreme it will be if it does indeed happen is anyone's guess. One of these doomers in the US gives advice on offshore banking and how to get a hold of a second passport and buying gold or offshore real estate. He talks about massive inflation, saying the same will occur in Europe and America in the fairly near future. It's not a Chicken Little overreaction, it's a virtual certainty. The same economic errors always bring the same catastrophic results. He talks about the U.S. national debt, which according to a debt clock online stands at $31.4 trillion as we write this show. For each U.S. citizen, it's a debt of around $94,000. The doomer says the debt is some $100 trillion when adding unfunded liabilities. The Wall Street Journal also said that writing in 2022, how much Washington really owes is $100 trillion. This includes the U.S. debt obligations in the future, such as pension plans. The money is owed, but it's not covered. This is very important in the show today. The world's eyes are on the U.S.'s economy, and some say that the U.S. is a ship lost at sea sailing into a storm it hasn't prepared for. The doomer analyst is not by himself in saying the crash is coming, and it's going to be one hell of a crazy time in the USA as people see their dollars turn to pennies. The economist Peter Schiff, aka Dr. Doom, just said in a podcast, inflation is probably a bigger threat now than it's ever been, and therefore it's an even bigger factor in determining everything we do. To some people, he's a well-respected economist who predicted the 2008 crash, but to others, he's wildly wrong in his assertions. He said the current generation is going to pay for the economic mismanagement of the older generation. He explained that hyperinflation might well come to the USA, saying the young generation is just going to leave the country if things get that bad. He doesn't blame China for this collapse, but he does see people offloading dollars and buying yuan, euros, or gold. He said he's predicted what's happening now and believes we're at a point now where inflation is about to run out of control. It's still early, he said, but things are going to implode. Are these people saying too many negatives, or do they have a point? Remember, Schiff is nicknamed Dr. Doom. Plenty of people disagree with him. Still, even the former Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey believes something will happen, tweeting in 2021, hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening. He added it will happen in the US soon, and so the world. Schiff said yet again they're ignoring the problems, sailing into a dark economic storm. We're heading for a currency crisis, he said, which will mean the collapse of the dollar. You might be wondering where China comes in on this, and that'll be explained soon, but you first ought to know something about the US's national debt, since that's the one reason everyone's talking about economic doom. That $31 trillion number sounds pretty big. It is, actually, but does it really matter? Most countries have a national debt. According to debt clocks, the UK's debt is $2.6 trillion, Spain is about $1.3 trillion, Poland $510 billion, China is $10 trillion, Russia $1 trillion, India $2.5 trillion, Japan $4.8 trillion, Brazil $2 trillion. You get the point. The national debt is also measured by a percent of the GDP, which puts Japan at the top, around 259%. Sudan and Greece were the next two. The US was in 14th place, Canada 19th, and France in 20th. You might be looking at these countries and figures and think, well, national debt obviously doesn't mean much in terms of standard of living. Japan's a great place to live, highly advanced, with a crime rate that makes the USA look like Mordor. Still, that debt might not mean much now, but it might in the future. Some people are indeed concerned about it in the USA. The US has been hitting record highs. The national debt increased a whopping 800% from 1989 to 2021. The graph looks like the Everest Base Camp to Camp 1. It's not just doomers saying that this is bad. Some established economists are also saying that it's critical that this gets sorted out. There are many reasons the debt got this bad. Let's now give you a simple example of how the national debt is created. Let's imagine you're the next POTUS. You've been watching all those YouTube videos of American infrastructure collapsing because, of course, YouTube is where you go to get all your information about your country. You decide to fund a massive infrastructure project that costs billions, but you don't have a federal budget for it. Never mind, you think, so you decide to sell bonds to investors with an interest rate. But at some point, they might want their money with the interest. But guess what? You might not have enough money from taxes and other revenue sources, so what do? Issue more bonds, of course. Wars don't come cheap. Economic downturns can be a pain in the butt, a la COVID. Tax cuts might not help either. And what if you got lots of old people not working and you have things such as healthcare programs for all these people? The US is not looking good in the demographics department, which is one reason why some analysts say the national debt is set to skyrocket as we approach 2050. We're now talking base camp 1 to the death zone. The US is going to have a lot of old folks that are going to need a lot of healthcare, and some people say that tax revenue won't be enough. These old people won't be earning and innovating. And what happens when you have to pay off your debt? That, of course, can affect day-to-day life for the regular citizen. It might mean unaffordable healthcare, education standards lapse, infrastructure crumbles, and perhaps, just perhaps, there will be unpredictable security threats. The interest payments this year for the national debt added up to $395.5 billion, a huge amount, considering it was more than elementary and secondary education, agriculture, or science and space programs. It's much more than $100+ billion the US spent in military aid to Ukraine. This is why a Pew Research poll said that 57% of Americans stated that addressing the national debt was a top priority. 25% said they somewhat agree it's a top priority, 11% said they somewhat disagree, and only 3% said they don't agree at all. 37% said they were somewhat optimistic the debt situation would improve, and 35% said they were somewhat pessimistic that things would improve. You also never know what might hit you. President Barack Obama increased the debt by $9.3 trillion in 8 years. He cut taxes and increased military spending, but after the 2008 crash, he introduced the very expensive American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. During Trump's presidency, the debt increased by $7.8 trillion, with the pandemic costing around $4 trillion. So far, under Biden, the debt has increased $3.7 trillion as of the making of this show. The debt is set to increase a lot more as time goes by, and it might not matter which political party is in charge. This does matter, according to many experts. The Balance website wrote, "Congress knows a debt crisis isn't far away. In less than 20 years, the Social Security Trust Fund won't have enough to cover the retirement benefits promised to people born from 1946 to 1964. That could mean higher taxes once the high U.S. debt rules out further loans from other countries." About 1/5 of the debt is intra-governmental debt held by federal agencies and other entities. This is the money the government owes to itself, meaning that one part of the government owes it to another part. The rest of the debt is public debt, which can be owed to actual individuals, businesses, and more importantly, foreign governments. It includes treasury bonds, bills, and securities held by the Federal Reserve and foreign governments. This money was borrowed to keep things running smoothly in the USA. Okay, so which countries own the most U.S. debt? Japan sits at number 1, about $1.08 trillion of U.S. debt. China has about $870 billion, the UK $645 billion, and Belgium $332 billion. Moving on, the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Countries like dollars. Dollars are stable. They've been stable in the past, that is. The International Monetary Fund says that 59% of all foreign bank reserves are in US dollars. We'll make this next part short, but it's something you need to know. As you know, the UK was the world superpower at the start of the 20th century, but it got kicked around in 2 world wars, as did much of Europe, while the US was making hay as a manufacturing giant. It became the biggest supplier of weapons and other goods. Notwithstanding all the dead American soldiers, the wars were a boon time for the US. For instance, US exports were $2.4 billion in 1913 and rose to $6.2 billion in 1917. There was the Great Depression between the World Wars, but World War II stimulated the U.S. economy again. 17 million new jobs were created, and industrial productivity went up by 96%. It was 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire that 22 allied nations met to talk about how to stabilize the world economy. The U.S. was now the world's leading economy. It had the most of the gold in the world. It hadn't been destroyed like much of Europe. So it was decided that the US dollar should be the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. Central banks were created. There was also the Marshall Plan, in which the US aided the rebuilding of broken Europe, which further cemented the dollar as the aid was in dollars. Countries bought U.S. Treasury securities, which they deemed as a safe way of storing money. Things changed around the time of the Vietnam War when the dollar became less stable. That's when the floating exchange rates that we have today were introduced. So the dollar became the world's reserve currency. In the dollar we trust. God bless the dollar. But is that faith waning? It hasn't always been plain sailing for the American buck. Now and again, there's been talk of the euro becoming the reserve currency. After all, the euro makes up about 21% of international foreign currency reserves. The 27 countries of the EU are a force of economic nature, with a GDP of around $16.6 trillion in 2022. Still less than China's $17 trillion and the US's $22 trillion. So again, have countries' faith in the dollar decreased? In 2009, China and Russia called for creating a new global reserve currency altogether independent of other currencies in the world. Notably, China was worried that the US dollar would lose value due to inflation and China would be stuck with less valuable dollars. The IMF rejected the proposal. Still, Russia said that the dominant but feeble dollar could be taken over by the Chinese yuan, a more stable currency, according to Russia. The two countries have remained economically very close, and over the years, reports have noted that China is indeed trying to internationalize its currency with Russia's support. In 2017, a Carnegie report stated, Beijing aims to act as a competitor to the US on the global financial stage. Still, the report said it was debatable if China wanted to shatter the dollar's role as the world's major reserve currency, as this could create major problems for China and might explode in its face. Still, that was then. A lot of things have happened in the last few years. It's as if the world has been shaken like a snow globe, but nothing was glued down. Yet again, Russia's talking about the Chinese yuan becoming the world's reserve currency. You might have noticed that Chinese President Xi Jinping just went to Moscow in the midst of the Ukraine war. China has told the world that it wants no part in the war, but there's more to global relations than sending weapons to countries. Yet again, the two countries made some economic agreements, 14 in all this time, which some critics have called a challenge to the US-led global order. China said in a press release that this meeting was not in any way a confrontation directed against third countries. Nonetheless, in a joint statement, they called for an acceleration of the process of establishing a multipolar world order. If you were the USA, it'd be hard not to see this as confrontational, given the US doesn't really want to relinquish its status as the sole superpower in what has been for years a unipolar world order. The two leaders talked about global stability and their belief that U.S. hegemony, geopolitically and economically, isn't good for stability. As for the matter of currencies, Putin said, "We are in favor of using the Chinese yuan for settlements between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I'm confident that these forms of settlement in yuan will develop between Russian partners and their counterparts in third countries." On top of this, BRICS, which is an economic group comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, will meet later this year in South Africa to discuss alternative global reserve assets, meaning not the dollar. Russia already has deals with India and China involving energy, and they don't want to use the dollar. They want to use the rupee and the yuan. Brazil just increased trade with China, and on a visit to China, the Brazilian president called for less reliance on the US dollar. Is this starting to sound like a familiar tune? Well, there's more. Saudi Arabia is set to build a $10 billion oil refinery in China, and yet again, the dollar is being threatened by this deal as the yuan will take its place with respect to the oil that'll be sold. France and China have also made a deal involving natural gas, which will be settled in yuan. A newspaper reported, "The trade involving 65,000 tons of LNG imported from the United Arab Emirates marks a major step in Beijing's attempts to undermine the US dollar as universal petrodollar for gas and oil trade." China has discussed multi-currency pricing and a diversified ecology. Also, central banks have been buying gold reserves. The demand for gold increased a massive 18% in 2022. The main reason that's been happening is because of the uncertainty of the dollar. In the first quarter of 2023, data suggests that this gold buying trend is taking off even more. Many economies are dumping their dollars and buying yuan or gold. These include China, Russia, France, Japan, and the UK. So-called de-dollarization is real. But let's not forget that about 90% of the trade in the world happens in dollars. Right now, only 2.8% of the world's exchange reserves are in yuan. As you know, 59% are in USD and around 20% in euros. The Japanese yen makes up 5.3% and the British pound 4.6%. As we started researching the show, major media companies reported this. For the first time ever, the yuan has eclipsed the US dollar as the most used currency for Chinese cross-border transactions. That's news, but when it comes to global currency transactions, the yuan only makes up 4.5%. The general consensus is that at the very least, the yuan is making inroads in its attack on the dollar. Still, those screaming the end of the dollar is nigh might be a little hysterical. As another analyst explained, the dollar to the world economy is what English is to international language. It'll be hard to replace. Things can change, but they'll change slowly. The problem for the US is they are changing slowly. Argentina has just made a deal with China to pay in yuan for its Chinese imports. The same story said nations in Southeast Asia are also pushing for de-dollarization, with Asian countries stating what other regions have been saying, that they are tired of the US's weaponization of its currency, which is causing countries to suffer. Bloomberg explained, the weaponization of the world's reserve currency, as through sanctions on those deemed bad actors such as Russia for its war in Ukraine, has pushed even the typically diplomatic Southeast Asians to warn the US of the consequences. The former foreign minister of Singapore just said the US dollar is a hex on all of us. Hex means curse, if you didn't know. He said what many people have been saying. If you start throwing your weight around and exploiting the dollar's seemingly omnipotence, replacements will naturally come. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked about the perils of the U.S. hegemony in 2023, saying the U.S. character is defined by violence and expansion. It calls taking advantage of the dollar seigniorage. On its website, the ministry wrote, it costs only about 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries have to pony up $100 of actual goods in order to obtain one. The hegemony of the U.S. dollar is the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. Here's a word-for-word example of the abuse according to China. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States abused its global financial hegemony and injected trillions of dollars into the global market, leaving other countries, especially emerging economies, to pay the price. In 2022, the Fed ended its ultra-easy monetary policy and turned to aggressive interest rate hikes, causing turmoil in the international financial market and substantial depreciation of other currencies. You might be thinking, well, China would say that. And indeed, this show is about how China might want to collapse the dollar. Saying such things can indeed hurt the US and its dollar. But China isn't the only country saying this. Other nations would agree with China when it talks about the US hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices. Is this how China brings in a new era of multipolarity? One newspaper said China had just lobbed a diplomatic grenade at the US. Americans are worried, according to a Pew Research poll that revealed 67% of people see China as a major threat to US power, and 66% said China's power and influence are getting stronger. 62% said they're worried about China's cozy relationship with Russia. Not everyone is worried, though. One person wrote on Twitter, "Goodbye dollar hegemony. Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand now have digital payment systems that enable settlements in local currencies. How long before this is replicated worldwide?" Good question, and while it's sensational, there is some truth to it. China has talked about setting up an Asian monetary fund to replace the IMF and the dollar. The Malaysian Prime Minister said in April 2023, there's no reason for Malaysia to continue depending on the dollar. India and Malaysia have already agreed to do business in the rupee. These Asian nations are at the center of global growth too. The IMF said this year it's expected that Asia will likely contribute more than 70% to global growth. The American Institute for Economic Research did admit that the U.S.'s economic warfare and error-fraught monetary policy regimes have been driving countries away. Still, given the numbers about global trading we've shown you today, it is impossible that the dollar will stop being used globally. Such a switch could never be done overnight, but that doesn't mean hyperinflation isn't on the way. The dollar is a proven and trusted currency, even if it's taken a bit of a hit. Has the balance of power been upset? Yes, a little. Could it get more unbalanced? For absolute sure. Will unipolar become bipolar? There's a chance, but not anytime soon. Has the US bitten off its nose to spite its face? Possibly. An economist in the Financial Times said the dollar's injuries are self-inflicted. He gave a number of reasons, stating these include financial sanctions against its rivals, restrictions to inward investment in many national security-sensitive sectors and firms, and even secondary sanctions against friends who violate the primary ones. More nations than we've discussed have expressed they want less reliance on the dollar in the face of the US creating challenging times for them, especially in the Middle East and South America. This is pretty shocking on the whole, and as one analyst told Bloomberg, it's been happening at a stunning pace. But as we keep saying, this should not collapse the dollar anytime soon. It's notable, but countries still rely on the dollar, and importantly, they fear the lack of transparency in China to want to rely on the yuan wholly. Undemocratic countries are probably not the best places to completely trust with your economy. The US also doesn't have strict capital controls, meaning people can easily access their funds, while China does have very strict capital controls. Authoritarian regimes are sometimes known for being arbitrary in what they decide is best, which scares nations. No one wants their money to suddenly become locked up. If we think of it this way, the euro is a bigger threat to the dollar than the yuan. Then again, it's the yuan making all the headway. The question is it good enough just repeating that the dollar is still king? And citing economic statistics as all-around walls start to slowly crumble and your almost century-old foundations begin to heave and creak like the deck of a pirate ship in the first throes of a storm. Some people believe the US better step up its game if it intends to keep wearing the heavy crown that gives it superpower status. Many say changes are afoot, and you'd be in denial to say there aren't. Those in the middle say the US needs to rethink its position as a superpower and find a way through this. As the great Niccolò Machiavelli said in his book The Prince, you can't sit back when you're on the top because someone's always trying to take your crown. He warned it's a common fault of men to not reckon on storms in fair weather. The US should heed that, many people are saying. All empires fall, all great powers decline. Your grip loosens and your influence often fades when you're too busy looking inwards or fighting amongst yourselves to see the wood through the trees. The New York Times in 2022 talked about how the US is now so polarized. People have less trust in the media and democracy than ever before. It cited a Pew Research poll that said just 17% of Americans nowadays believe U.S. democracy is not a good example for other countries to follow. But China, that's an autocracy, and you won't find many Americans who want to live under one of those. A Harvard scholar said in that article, one of the side effects of losing democracy is losing control over the markets. I think it's an incredibly dangerous moment. I think we absolutely could lose democracy. As a French expert on foreign policy said in 2023, this is very unlike the America of the past. It looks like this will be a century of disorder, and that's pretty scary. In 2022, an article in The Conversation discusses the myth of the American hyperpower, meaning, as we just said, the US might be intoxicated with its own strength as a shipwrecking storm blows in on the horizon. Even so, the dollar isn't going anywhere as the reserve currency, not yet and not for a while, but when you have countries all over the world starting to consider using other currencies, the US might need to take note. The historian Niall Ferguson thinks that, saying in an interview, that we should not underestimate how quickly the structure of the international financial system would change if the US was no longer the credible #1 global superpower. He then said a world with China as the #1 power was far from agreeable, saying the old totalitarian devil could pop its head up when it feels like it needs to wield power. He also mentioned that we are in a Cold War and China needs to be contained, possibly by cutting it off technologically. Then again, the US's foreign policy over the decades and troubles at home had plenty of critics who usually said the US needed to change how it leads as a superpower. They say multipolarity is certain, so good diplomacy is the only thing that would prevent us from destroying ourselves. From what we can see, some people are exaggerating about the speed and certainty of the dollar's value falling, but others are in denial about any possible fall. The truth is, this is a crossroads moment in history. There might not be an alternative to the dollar right now, but one might come, especially if the US gives countries reasons to not trust its currency. As the Roman statesman and philosopher Seneca once said, there is no favorable wind for the sailor who does not know where to go. Many are saying the US needs to get its ship back on track, or bigger ships will blow it out of the water. Now you need to watch Why is the South of Italy Poor? Or have a look at real reason why 50% of murders happen here.